What would it actually take to make a man unrecognizable? Not in a story. In practice, on a particular evening, when the man in question is one of the most famous faces on that coast, and the place he intends to walk into is a walled city where every single person has spent 10 years learning to hate him by name. Clothes will not do it. A hood will not do it. Dirt helps, but only a little. Dirt washes off a face in the rain, and there is a shape underneath that people know. The answer the old poets gave is much more uncomfortable, and it is the reason this story stayed in the tradition when 100 prettier ones fell out. You have to change your body. You have to be hurt. Come and stand at the back of a hut on a beach, in the last of the light, and watch it being done. The camp is behind you, and it is enormous, and it sounds like a town, because it is one by now, a decade old, with lanes worn between the huts and a market of sorts, and children who were born here, cooking fires, a smith working late, somebody's donkey, the endless low grind of the sea on sand, which everyone here stopped hearing years ago. But behind this particular hut, there is nobody, and there is a man sitting on an upturned tub with his tunic off, and another man standing behind him with a leather strap in his hand. The one standing does not want to do this. You can see that in how he holds it. The one sitting has given instructions. Hard enough to raise a proper weal. Not so hard it opens right through, because an open wound will go bad in 3 days, and he needs to be walking, and needs to look like a man who has been beaten repeatedly over a long period, which is a different thing entirely from a man beaten once. He wants the marks old and new, layered. So it takes a while, and it is done in the failing light, and there is no dialogue in any version of this scene. Nobody makes a speech. It is simply two competent men doing a piece of preparation, the way you would prepare a boat or a weapon, and the material happens to be a back. Afterwards, he sits for a bit with his forearms on his knees. Let yourself settle wherever you are lying. Nothing in this story is going to jolt you. The worst of it is the part you have just heard, and it is over, and everything from here on is quiet. A road, a gate, a street at dusk, a room with a fire in it, and a bowl of warm water. If these long nights are of use to you, A-Lake helps this small channel find other people awake at this hour, and I like knowing who is listening. Leave your town and the time on your clock in a comment before you drift off, and I will read it in the morning. Now, why does anybody do this? Because the war has stopped working, and everybody in that camp knows it. 10 years. The walls have never been taken. The best fighter on either side has been killed, and it changed nothing. And the man who killed him has been killed too, and it changed nothing. 2 of the great captains are dead, one of them by his own hand, and the army is arguing more than it is fighting. And in the last months, a series of prophecies has arrived, one after another, each one specifying a condition that must be met before the city can fall. Fetch the bow from the island where you abandoned a man 10 years ago. Fetch the son of the dead champion. Take the sacred image out of the temple on the citadel. That last one is the problem. It is an object inside a locked shrine in the highest part of a defended city, and nobody in the Greek camp has ever been up there. And nobody knows the streets, or the guard rotations, or which quarter is held by which allied contingent, or even how many gates there are on the landward side. You cannot plan a raid into a place you have never seen, so somebody has to go in and look. And the man who volunteers is the one who always volunteers for this kind of thing. Not because he is the bravest, and he would tell you so himself, but because he is the only one with the particular set of talents it requires. He is a good liar. That is not a moral judgment in his world. It is a professional qualification. He is patient. He can hold a false story in his head for hours and keep it consistent under questioning, and he has a gift, which the poems mention repeatedly, for inventing a whole plausible life on the spot. A name, a father, a home port, a run of bad luck, delivered without hesitating. And he is, physically, an unusual-looking man for a hero. The poems are oddly insistent about it. Short in the leg, broad in the chest and shoulders, so that sitting down, he looked like a king, and standing up, he looked like a farmhand, which, for a man who wants to be looked at and dismissed, turns out to be the most useful thing about him. Where did he learn it? The poems answer that too, and the answer goes back to his grandfather. His mother's father was a man who lived up on the slopes of Parnassos in the high country in the middle of Greece, and he had a reputation across the whole of the Greek world for two things: thieving and swearing oaths he had no intention of keeping. He was, the poem says, the best of all men at those two arts. And he had them as a gift from a god, the Quick One, the god of travelers and traders and thieves and anyone who moves at night, because he had always burned him good offerings. There was a story about him stealing a herd of cattle and altering their hoofprints so the tracks led the wrong way. There was a story about him being caught out only once by a man cleverer still, who marked his animals' hooves so they printed the words "stolen by Autolycos" into the dust. That is the grandfather. And when the child was born, they sent for him. The old man came down to the island, and the nurse put the baby on his knees and asked him to give the child a name. Because in that family the grandfather named the children, and what he said was this: "I have come here having been angered with a great many men and women over the wide earth. So let the child be called by that. Let him be named for the anger." The name he gave means something like the man of resentment. It can be read actively or passively, and the Greek allows both. And the poem plays on the ambiguity for two whole epics: the man who gives pain and the man to whom pain is given. Both are true. It is one of the great pieces of naming in literature, and it is done by an old thief in a room with a fire. Then he told them to send the boy up to him when he was grown, and there would be presents. And they did. And when the boy was in his teens, he went up to Parnassos and was welcomed and fed. And in the morning they went out hunting with the dogs, up through the wet woods before the sun was properly over the ridge, and in a thicket so dense that neither wind nor rain nor sunlight got into it. In a hollow of dead leaves, there was a boar. It came out at them, and he went in first, and he killed it. But it got him above the knee with a sideways rip of the tusk as he came, and took a long piece of flesh out of his thigh. They bound the wound and sang a charm over it to stop the bleeding, which was ordinary medicine then, and it healed, and he went home with his presents and a scar. Hold on to that scar. We are going to need it much later tonight, in a room with a basin of warm water, 40 years further on. Now the costume, which is not a costume, and this is where the story gets its teeth. What does a beggar look like in that world? Not a man in a clean cloak holding out a hand. Look at the description the same poet gives elsewhere, when the same man does the same trick in his own house years later, and you get a full inventory. A tunic that is not a tunic anymore. A bad, ragged, smoke-stained thing, torn and retorn. With the weave gone soft and greasy at the neck. Over it a hide. The skin of a deer with the hair worn off in patches, thrown on as a cloak. A stick, a leather bag with a strap, split at the corner and tied, for whatever he is given, and no shoes. He rubs himself with dirt, and not evenly. Dirt goes into the creases first, the neck, the backs of the hands, the folds of the elbow, and it takes days to look right. And then there is the smell, which no vase painting can give you and which is the largest part of any disguise. A man who has not washed for 2 weeks, in wool in a Mediterranean summer, in a hide that was never properly cured, is not somebody anybody stands close to. People do not look carefully at a person they are trying not to breathe near. That is the whole trick. And it is a piece of applied psychology, 2,500 years old. He is not making himself invisible. He is making himself unpleasant, which is far more reliable. But the marks on the back are the part that matters, and here is why. A beggar in that culture was not simply a poor man. He was a category, with a history attached, and the history was legible on the body. Weals meant a slave who had run or been punished, a man who had been taken in a raid and used badly and got out. It meant somebody had owned him. So the disguise is not a set of clothes. It is a biography, written where anyone can read it, in a language everybody knew. And that changes what people ask him. Nobody says, "Who are you? And where are you from? And what are you doing in our city in the 10th year of a siege?" They say, "You poor devil, what happened to you?" And then they answer the question themselves before he has to. That is craft. That is a man who has thought this through. Now, before he walks, one thing has to be said about what a beggar meant in that world, because it is the load-bearing beam under this entire story and under the second half of his life. You did not turn a beggar away. The law of guest friendship, the obligation to feed the stranger at your door before you even ask his name, is the strongest social rule in that culture, and it extends downward all the way. The wanderer with nothing is under the personal protection of the king of the gods, who has a title for exactly this, the god of strangers and suppliants, and beggars, specifically, were said to come from him. And there is a belief underneath that which turns up in the poems again and again, and which every listener knew, that the gods themselves go about disguised as travelers from far away, taking on all sorts of shapes, going from town to town, watching how people behave. So the ragged man in your doorway might be a god. Nobody in that world thought this was likely on any given evening. But nobody thought it was impossible either. And the practical effect was that a hungry stranger got fed in a landscape with no inns, no police, and no other mechanism for keeping travelers alive. Which means that when this particular man puts on that particular disguise, he is not only making himself hard to see, he is wrapping himself in the one identity in the entire ancient world that it is dangerous to harm. He is walking into an enemy city inside the only thing that could be called armor there. The tragedians, centuries later, took a much colder view of the whole enterprise, and we will come to that, because one of them wrote a scene about this night that is very hard to read and impossible to forget. For now, the road. There is one more piece of preparation, and it is the one nobody thinks about, and it is the hardest. He has to stop eating. A man who has been fed on an army ration for 10 years does not look hungry. His face is full. His forearms are heavy. Beggars in that world were recognizable at 50 paces by a particular gauntness, the hollow under the cheekbone, the ribs, the wrists. And none of that can be applied with a bit of dirt. The sources do not say how long he gave it. 2 or 3 days would do a great deal at that age, in that heat, with no food and very little water, and it would also produce the other thing he needs, which is the way a starving man moves. Slowly, without lifting the feet much, stopping to sit down more often than he means to. You cannot act that. You can only be it, which tells you something about the sort of preparation this man does, and it is a pattern in every story about him. He never relies on performance when he can arrange for the thing to be true. He does not pretend to be beaten. He is beaten. He does not pretend to be starving. He starves. He does not pretend the horse is an offering. He has an offering carved into it. The lie always has a true object underneath it. That is the method, and it is why it works. He goes at dusk, alone on foot, from the far end of the beach, where the ships of the northern contingents are drawn up, and he goes inland first, away from the walls, and comes round through the low ground, so as to arrive at the gate from the wrong direction, from the countryside, like somebody who has walked in from a burned village, not from a Greek camp. Feel the walk. He has no shoes, and he has not gone barefoot for years, and the first mile is agony, stubble and dried mud rutted hard by carts, and the small sharp stones that get between the toes. By the second mile, his feet are numb and bleeding a little, and that is fine. That is correct. That is exactly what they should look like. The plain here is not empty. There are burned farms. There are field walls and ditches, and the stumps of an olive grove that somebody cut down for firewood in the 3rd year and never replanted, because who plants an olive in a siege? There is a river, low at this season, and a ford with reeds, and the smell of the water, flat, green, warm at the edges. The light goes. The city ahead of him is a black shape with the last of the sky behind it and the towers picked out, and there are lamps and torches coming on inside, showing at the wall in a scattered line. And he stops in a ditch a bowshot from the gate and sits down in the dark and does the last part of it, which is the hardest and the most impressive. He waits for morning, and he becomes somebody else. What does it mean to become somebody else when nobody has invented the word for acting yet? It means the body mostly, and the poems are unusually precise about it. The first thing to go is the walk. A man who has commanded for 20 years walks from the hips with his weight forward. A man who expects to be shoved walks from the shoulders, slightly turned, ready to be moved and not minding. Then the hands. A beggar's hands are never still and never open at rest. They are drawn in, close to the body or held out, and either way, there is a small tremor in them that comes from cold and from hunger and from being frightened for a long time, and it can be manufactured for as long as you remember to do it. Then the eyes, and this is the difficult one, because his entire reason for being there is to look at things, and a man looking hard at a gate, at a guard rotation, at the angle of a street, is the single most recognizable thing in any city under siege. So he has to learn to see everything without looking at anything. And the trick, which spies have used ever since, and which he seems to have worked out on his own, is to look at the ground and count and use the sound. The gate opens at first light. They open it because they must. A besieged city that never opens its gates starves. There are fields still being worked on the far side of the river under guard, water to be fetched, animals to be driven out to whatever grazing is left. And every morning there is a controlled trickle of people going out and coming in. He goes in with the second group, behind a man leading 2 goats. The gateway is deeper than you expect, a passage through a wall thicker than a room, with the light at both ends and a cold damp shade in the middle, and the sound of everything changing as you pass through it, footsteps knocking off the stone and coming back. There are men at the inner end. There always are. And they stop him. This is the moment. And here is what actually happens. Nothing much. They look him over. One of them says something about the state of him. He does the thing he has come to do, which is to hold out a hand and produce a story with the accent slightly wrong for the region, in the tone of a man who has told it too many times to too many people who did not care. A farm, up country, burned. A brother taken. 2 years in a household somewhere south, and the marks on his back for it. Walking since. Not one word of it is checkable, and none of it needs to be because it is the story of about 4,000 other people currently inside those walls. In the 10th year of a war, a city is full of the displaced. The refugees are the camouflage. Somebody gives him a shove between the shoulder blades to move him along, which he has been expecting, and he goes through into the town. And now let him walk, and walk with him, because this is the quiet center of the whole night, and there is nothing dangerous in it at all. The lower town first. Narrow lanes, unpaved, with a shallow channel down the middle where the water goes when it rains. Houses of mud brick on stone footings, flat-roofed, built up against each other so the walls are shared. Doorways with a curtain instead of a door. And the smell coming out of each one different. Fire, wet grain, a goat kept inside, oil, someone's sickness, bread from somewhere, and it goes through him like a blow. He has eaten in a Greek camp for 10 years, and the bread there is bread. This is a real oven in a real house, and the smell in a street at 7 in the morning is the same in every century. The city is crowded. That is the first thing he learns, and it goes straight into the report. Too many people packed in, rooms subdivided, whole families in spaces meant for storage, livestock inside the walls, grain jars in the corners of living rooms. He learns that the water comes from a spring outside the eastern wall, and that there is an argument about it every morning. He learns where the Allied contingents are billeted, because the men from the east dress differently, and their women wear different pins, and they are all in one quarter, near the lower gate. He learns that there is one narrow way up to the citadel from this side, and that it is watched at the bottom, and that there is another way up from the northeast that is not. He does not write anything down. There is nothing to write on, and it would kill him. He walks the same 3 streets 4 times over the course of the morning, and at every corner he pauses and adjusts the strap on his bag, and by the 4th pass, he could draw the whole quarter from memory. Some scholars think this whole episode is a late invention, precisely because it is so unlike the fighting the poems mostly describe. An operation with no glory in it, achieved entirely by walking about and being ignored. Others point out that the story is told inside the oldest poem we have, by a character, as something everybody in the room already knows, which is usually a sign of considerable age. Either way, what it describes is a real thing, done by real people, in every war before and since. There is a distinction being exploited here that is easy to miss, and it is the sharpest thing about the whole disguise. That world had two kinds of wanderer, and they were not the same at all. The first kind was welcome everywhere. A seer, a healer, a carpenter, a shipwright, a singer. These were the men people actually sent for, and they went from town to town all their lives and were fed at the best tables wherever they arrived, because they carried a skill and everybody needed it. There is a passage in the poems that lists them exactly like that. Whoever goes and invites a stranger from abroad, unless he is one of those who work for the people, they were welcome because they were useful. And the second kind was the beggar, who was not useful and who was therefore fed on a completely different principle. Not because anyone wanted him there, but because of the God who stands behind the doorway of every house. Two categories, and the difference between them is everything. The useful stranger is invited in and seated and asked questions at length, all evening, about who he is and where he comes from and what he has seen, which is precisely what would have killed the man we are following. The useless one is fed at the door and not asked anything, because nobody wants the conversation. He picks the second category on purpose. He gives up the good seat and the warm room and the respect, and takes the sill and the draft and the leftovers, and buys with it the one thing he needs, which is that nobody in the entire city has any reason to find out who he is. That is the calculation, and it is a cold one, and it works. And in the middle of the morning, he sits down against a wall in the sun, because that is what a beggar does, and he holds out the bag. And this is the part I find hardest, and I think the poets knew it. People give him things, not everybody. Most walk past, and a few say something unkind, and one boy throws a stone at him for the pleasure of it and misses. But a woman coming back from the ovens breaks off a piece and puts it in the bag without breaking her stride or looking at him. An old man gives him a handful of olives and stands there talking at him for a while about his knees. A girl of about 9 is sent out of a doorway by her mother with a cup of water, and she waits, standing, while he drinks it, because she has been told to bring the cup back. He is sitting in the sun in the middle of the enemy, being fed by the enemy in the 10th year, while working out how to get up to their citadel. 10 years of being told and telling other people that these are a lying, treacherous, oath-breaking people who deserve everything that is coming to them. And a girl waits patiently for her cup. Nothing is made of this in the ancient sources. Not one line. I am pointing at it because I think it is impossible to sit inside that scene for any length of time and not feel it, and because everything he does for the next 20 years of his life has this day underneath it. He goes up as far as he is allowed in the afternoon, which is not far. The citadel is a separate thing from the town. That is the layout of every settlement of that kind. The lower town spreading down the slope where most people live, and above it, a walled acropolis with the palace and the shrines and the storerooms, reached by a ramp with its own gate. A beggar can get to the bottom of the ramp and no further. He can sit near it, though, and watch what goes up and comes down and when, and who is stopped and who is waved through. And from the bottom of the ramp, he can see the roof of the building he has come about, because the object all of this is for is up there in the temple of the armed goddess, and it is not large. The descriptions vary, and none of them agree, which is what you would expect of a thing very few people were allowed to look at. Most say it was a wooden figure, old, small, 3 cubits, some said, so about the length of your forearm 3 times over, of a goddess standing with a spear raised in one hand, and in the other, a distaff and a spindle. War in one hand, and woolwork in the other. That was her, precisely. It was said to have fallen out of the sky in the reign of the city's founder, landing beside his tent while the walls were still being laid out, and to have been housed ever since in a shrine where only a few people could go. Some accounts claim it had moved, that the eyes had been seen to shift, that it had once turned away from a suppliant, and the belief attached to it was simple and total. While it stayed inside those walls would hold. Which is why every prophecy about the end of that war eventually arrives at the same instruction, and why a man is sitting at the bottom of a ramp in the sun, apparently asleep, counting how many armed men go up it in an hour. 9, if you want the sort of number he was after. 9 in an hour, in twos, at no fixed interval, and one of them stops each time at the top to speak to somebody out of sight. That last detail is the one worth having. It means there is a post up there that cannot be seen from below. By late afternoon, he has what he came for, and that is when it goes wrong, because somebody recognizes him. How would you know a man you had seen perhaps twice, years earlier, across a hall when he is now filthy and barefoot and looking at the ground? She knew him anyway. That is all the source says, that she alone recognized him. We should be careful here because this is one of those episodes where we have exactly one account and it comes from an interested party. The scene survives in one place only, a passage in the second of the two great poems, spoken aloud at a dinner table in a palace in the south of Greece, years after the war. By the woman it happened to, she is telling it to a young man who has come looking for news of his missing father. And the missing father is the beggar in the story. So she is telling a son about his father, and telling it well, and choosing what to include. Here is what she says. He came into the city having beaten himself with a whip, and put miserable rags on his shoulders, and gone in like a household slave. In that shape, he went through the wide streets of the enemy, and he made himself look like a different man altogether. A beggar, which was nothing like what he was at the Greek ships. And she says, I alone recognized him, being that sort of man, and I questioned him, and he kept dodging me. That phrase is worth stopping on. Not he confessed, or he broke down. He dodged, even caught, even known, even with a woman standing in front of him who has just said his name. The first instinct is to keep the false story running for as long as it will run. Then she says she took him home and bathed him. Understand what that means? Because it is not a small domestic detail. It is the most loaded action in the entire episode. Washing a guest is the core ritual of hospitality in that world. You take a stranger in, and before anything else, before the questions, before the meal, he is bathed and rubbed with oil and given clean clothes. It is done for kings, and it is done for beggars, and it is the physical act by which a stranger stops being a threat and becomes a guest. So she does the whole thing. In her telling, she washed him herself and anointed him with oil and put clothing on him and swore a great oath not to reveal him among the Trojans until he had got back to the ships and the huts. Feel that room, because after everything else in this story, it is like walking indoors out of weather. A bronze basin, water heated over a fire and carried in a jug, poured warm over the shoulders and back, and it finds every one of those weals and stings like salt for a moment before the warmth gets through. Steam in a cool room, the dust coming off him in streaks, and the water going dark. Then the oil. Olive oil, warmed slightly in the hand, worked into the shoulders and forearms and the cracked skin of the feet. That was universal in the Greek world. You did not dry yourself, you oiled yourself, and the smell of a clean person in that period is the smell of warm olive oil, faintly green. Then cloth that has been folded in a chest with herbs in it. The most wanted man in that city, sitting on a stool in a room in the middle of it, being cared for by the woman the whole war is nominally about. And then, she says, he told her everything. The whole intention of the Greeks, which means the disguise was blown, the mission was compromised, and he continued anyway, and got out. She finishes the story with a sentence that has caused 2,500 years of argument, and I will give it to you as flatly as I can. She says, and then as he went, he killed many of the Trojans with the long sword and came back to the Greek army bringing much information. And the other Trojan women wailed aloud, but my own heart rejoiced, because it had already turned toward going home again, and I was grieving for the madness that had been put on me. There is a great deal in there. Readers have long wondered about the killing. It is the only violent line in the episode, and it sits oddly against the rest. A man who has spent a day being invisible, cutting his way out through people he has been begging from. Some take it as a later insertion by a poet who felt the scene needed a hero in it. Others read it as the plain truth of what such an operation costs on the way home and think the discomfort is the point. And then there is her. She is describing the deaths of the women of a city she had lived in for 10 years and describing her own pleasure at it, at her own dinner table, in front of her husband, to a boy she has just met. The line about madness is her defense, and it is the one the poems generally give her, that what she did was put on her from outside by a goddess, and that she was not herself. Whether we are meant to believe her is not something the poem will tell you. It does something better and much stranger, which is that a few minutes later at that same fire, her husband tells a second story about the same siege, in which she walks around a large wooden object in the dark, imitating the voices of the wives of the men hidden inside it, trying to make them answer. 2 accounts. Same nights, same city, same marriage, opposite meanings. Nobody at the table comments on the collision. That night and what it says about both of them is a whole other story, and one worth its own long evening. For our purposes, the useful thing is this. Even in her own telling, the version most flattering to herself, the disguise fails. He does not get through Troy unrecognized. He gets through Troy recognized by at least one person, and survives on the goodwill of somebody who had every reason to hand him over. And in one strand of the tradition, it was not one person, it was 2. By the time the tragedians got hold of this material 400 years later, they were not interested in the cleverness of it at all. One of them wrote a play in which an old woman, the queen of that city, now a slave, standing on a beach among the ruins of everything, turns to the man from the rocky island and reminds him, to his face, of the day he came in disguise. Her version is not gentle. She says, "You came into Troy as a spy, in rags, in a wretched disguise, and the blood was running down from your eyes onto your beard. And I knew you. I recognized you, and I told no one else, and I alone kept it from the city." And she says he took hold of her knees. That gesture is not incidental. Supplication in that world had a fixed physical form, and it was absolutely specific. You got down and took the other person's knees in your hands and reached up toward the chin or the beard. And once you had done that, you were under the protection of the gods and could not be harmed without consequence. It is the same protection as the beggars deliberately claimed with the body. In her account, he did it and groveled and said whatever was needed. And she gave him his life and got him out of the city. And then, on that beach years later, she is asking him for one thing in return, and he refuses her. The Greek army has decided that a girl of the royal house must be given to the dead, a demand that came, they said, from a ghost, and that the fleet would not sail without, and it is he standing there who has argued for it in the assembly, and argued well, because arguing well is what he does. She reminds him of the debt. He does not deny a word of it. He simply says that the state has its needs, and that a man who has done great service must be honored, and that this is how such things are decided. I'm not going to take you through what follows. The girl walks up the beach herself, refusing to be led, and there is a scene that is one of the most upsetting things ever put on a stage, and it is not for tonight. What matters here is the shape. The disguise that saved him was mercy, given twice by women of that city, and paid back with an argument in a committee. There is disagreement about whether that version was ever part of the older tradition, or whether the playwright made it up to give his play a spine. The older poem knows only the queen of Sparta as the one who recognized him, but something in the tragedian's instinct is exactly right, and it is the thing this whole night keeps circling. This is a story in which a man survives by claiming the protection that the powerless are owed, and the poets could not stop asking what such a man owes back. It is worth putting this night beside the one that went wrong, because the tradition preserves both, and the pair of them together is an education. In the older poem, there is an entire book about a night operation. 2 Greeks going out across the plain in the dark to see what the enemy is doing. They dress for it. One of them puts on a helmet made of boar's tusks, split and sewn in rows onto a leather cap. an object so old-fashioned that scholars once thought it was invented, until archaeologists dug several of them up and dated them to centuries before the poem. One wears a lion's skin. They carry no shields. And on the way, out in the dark between the two armies, they run into somebody coming the other way, because the Trojans have had exactly the same idea and sent out a man of their own. He is called Dolon, and his name comes from the Greek word for a trick, and he is the amateur to their professional. He is the only son among 5 sisters, and he is rich, and he is fast on his feet, and he has volunteered for this in front of the assembly in exchange for a promised reward, which he names himself. And the reward he asks for is the immortal horses of the dead champion, which is a wildly excessive thing to ask, and tells you everything about him. He puts on a wolf skin and a cap of marten fur and goes out at a run. They hear him coming. They lie down flat among the bodies on the plain and let him go past, and then get up and chase him, and he runs, and they run him down like a dog running a hare. And when they have him, he tells them everything, immediately, without being pressed, in detail, where the sentries are, who is sleeping where, which contingent has just arrived, and where its horses are picketed. He tells them all of it because he is frightened and because he believes he will be let go. He is not let go. That is the counterexample. Same night, same plane, same job. And the difference between the man who comes back and the man who does not is not courage, and it is not luck. It is preparation, and it is the ability to keep talking when everything has gone wrong. One of them walks into an enemy city alone and gets out. The other cannot hold a story together for 5 minutes in the dark. Now, what the reconnaissance was for. He gets back over the ditch in the dark with the information, and within a few nights, he is going in again, and this time not alone and not as a beggar. The second operation is the theft of the sacred image, the small ancient wooden figure of the armed goddess that fell from heaven, kept in the shrine on the citadel, on which the safety of the city was said to depend. He goes with the one man in the army who is his opposite in every respect, a young, enormous direct fighter from the Argolid, the only mortal who has ever wounded gods in open battle, and a man not remotely capable of pretending to be anybody else. They go up at night, in through the gap he found, up the northeastern approach that nobody watches, and they take it out of the shrine and carry it down through the sleeping town and out. And on the way back, in the dark, on the plain, the story turns strange. Some traditions claim that as they walked, with the image under one man's cloak, the man behind drew his sword. The reasoning was simple enough. 2 men carry the prize. One of them will be remembered for it, and the man in front, walking with the goddess, is the one everybody will name. What happened next is told 2 ways. In one, he saw the sword's shadow thrown ahead of him on the moonlit ground and turned and disarmed the situation with words, as he does. In the other, he saw nothing and was saved by the plain fact that the man behind him could not bring himself to do it, and instead drove him back to the camp with the flat of the blade, prodding him along the whole way like a mule. That second version was proverbial for centuries afterwards. There was a phrase in Greek, a particular kind of necessity, named after the man with the sword, meaning a course of action you are compelled into by somebody at your back. Whether either happened, nobody can say. What survives is the flavor, a partnership that worked perfectly at the highest level of skill between 2 men who did not entirely trust each other and were right not to. And the city, with its protecting image gone, is now ready for what comes next. The carpenter and the timber and the thing on the beach, which is another night's story and one I have already told. So we have the disguise and the information and the raid and the fall. What we have not done is ask the question that the whole of the rest of his life turns on, which is why this particular trick, out of everything he ever did, is the one he goes back to, because he does it again. And the second time, it is not a mission of a single day. It is weeks, in his own house, in front of his own family, and it is by a very long way the strangest thing in Greek literature. 10 years after the city falls, he comes home. and he does not walk up to his own door and announce himself. He arrives on a beach at night, alone, put ashore by strangers while he was asleep, with everything he owns stacked beside him under an olive tree. And the first thing he does on the soil of the kingdom he has spent 20 years trying to reach is lie about who he is to the first person he meets. And the lies he tells there are worth a moment, because they are the same instrument, refined by 20 years of use. He tells 4 of them to 4 different people, and every one is a complete invented life with a family and a country and a plausible run of misfortune delivered without a pause. 3 of the 4 are Cretan. That is a joke the audience got instantly. Crete was the standard homeland of the plausible stranger in that world, big enough and far enough that nobody could check. And there was a proverb about Cretans, and truth that was already old. The stories are magnificent. In one, he is a rich man's illegitimate son who inherited little, went raiding to Egypt, was ruined, and was carried off by pirates. In one, he has met the missing king personally and can report he is alive and coming, which is the only part that is true and is the one nobody believes. In one, he tells a long, self-deprecating story about a cold night at Troy and a cloak, purely to get a blanket out of a servant without asking for one. The poem admires this openly. It says he made many false things sound like the truth, and it is not a criticism. That is the difference between him and every other hero in the tradition. The others have a thing they can do: run, throw, fight, endure. His is a facility with other people's assumptions, and it is not a metaphor. It is a trained skill that he practices, refines, and keeps in condition, and which he first put to serious use on a dusty morning in an enemy street with a bag over his shoulder. Then a goddess turns him into an old man. The description is the most detailed transformation in the poem, and it is worth hearing because it is the beggar of Troy again, done properly this time by somebody with real power. She shriveled the fine skin on his supple limbs and destroyed the fair hair from his head, and put the skin of an old man on all of him and dimmed his 2 eyes that had been so beautiful. She put a bad rag on him and a tunic, torn and filthy and smoke-stained, and over it a great hairless hide of a swift deer. And she gave him a stick and a wretched bag full of holes with a twisted strap for it. Same costume, same category. Only now it is real from the inside, and it lasts. And what he does with it is not espionage. It is something much closer to an experiment, and it is horrible to read, because what he is doing is finding out what his household is really like when nobody is performing for the master. He goes first to a farm at the edge of his own land and stays with the man who keeps his pigs, an old servant who has been running the estate honestly for 20 years for an owner he believes is dead, and who takes in a filthy stranger at nightfall and feeds him the best he has and gives him his own cloak to sleep under because it is a cold night, and says the thing that turns the whole poem over: that all strangers and beggars come from the god, and that a gift, even a small one, is what he can give. He is being kind to a man who owns him. Then the town. Then the house. He walks in through his own front door with a bag over his shoulder and sits on the threshold, on the wooden sill, which is where a beggar sits, at the very edge of the room in the draft. And an old dog lying on a pile of dung outside recognizes him instantly, because dogs are not fooled by any of this, and lifts its head and moves its tail and cannot get up and dies. 3 lines. Nothing else in world literature does what those 3 lines do. Inside, they insult him. They throw things, a footstool, and later, an ox's hoof. He is made to fight another beggar for the entertainment of the room. He is told to get out. He is threatened, and he takes it. All of it for days while doing the arithmetic. And this is where the theme of tonight finally lands. So let me say it plainly. The disguise is not concealment. It is a method of seeing. He learns more about his own house in a week on that threshold than in the previous 20 years, because a beggar is spoken in front of, not to. He finds out which servants are decent and which are not. He finds out how his son has turned out and how his wife has held the place together, and exactly who is eating his food. And the poem is completely explicit about what it thinks of the answers, because the way people treat the ragged man on the sill is the moral test of every single character in the second half. To ancient listeners, this was not a plot device. It was the belief we started with, dramatized at full length, that the stranger at your door might be somebody else entirely, and that how you behave in that moment is the whole of you. There is one more thing about the transformations, and it is the detail I cannot get past. He is recognized anyway, every time. In the whole of that poem, in the perfect disguise made by a goddess, he is found out by an old servant washing his feet, who feels a scar on his thigh from a boar hunt when he was a boy and drops his leg into the basin, by a dog, by his own son, once she allows it, and finally by his wife, who does not accept any evidence at all until she has set a trap of her own about the construction of their bed. The face can be changed, the skin, the hair, the eyes, the voice, and it never once holds against somebody who knew the body. And there is a shape underneath all of it that people have been noticing for a very long time, and it goes back to a cave with a very large occupant and a name he gave when he was in trouble. The name that meant nobody at all. He got out of that cave by being no one, and then could not bear it, and shouted his real name across the water and paid for it for the rest of his life. He has been doing the same trick since. Become nobody, get in, get out. The difference at the end is that he learns to keep his mouth shut about it, and that is arguably the whole arc of the man. Some readers find something sad in that. A king who is only really himself when he is nobody. A man so practiced at inventing lives that he needs his wife to trap him before he can prove he is real. I think the poem knows. The bed she asks about is one he built himself, out of a living olive tree still rooted in the ground under the house, and it cannot be moved without cutting it. And it is the one thing in his life that is not a story he can change. There is one relationship in all of this that I want to give you before we go out through the gate, because it is warmer than anything else in the tradition, and it is the reason the disguises are never lonely. The goddess who dresses him as a beggar on his own beach is not doing it as a favor to a client. She likes him. She says why, and the reason is not that he is brave. There is a scene on the shore of his own island, minutes after he has been put down there asleep. He wakes up, does not recognize the place, and a young shepherd appears and tells him where he is. And instead of falling on his knees and thanking heaven, he immediately produces a false story about being a fugitive from Crete who killed a man in a dispute over plunder, standing on his own beach, to a stranger, out of pure reflex. And the shepherd changes and is a tall woman, and she is laughing at him. She strokes his hand, that is in the text, a small physical gesture that is startling in a poem this size. And she says that he would have to be a thief and a cheat of the first order to get past her in a trick, that even a god would have trouble, and that the two of them are the same. He is by far the best of mortals at planning and at speaking, and she is famous among the gods for exactly those two things. And here they both are, doing it to each other on a beach at dawn. That is one of the very few moments in Greek myth where a god and a mortal are simply pleased with one another, and it recontextualizes everything we have looked at tonight. The beggar at Troy, the rags, the marks on the back, the lie at the gate. These are not the compromises of a hero who could not fight. They are the thing he is actually best at, the thing that makes a goddess laugh out loud with recognition, and the thing that gets him home when every other man who fought at that city is dead or scattered. The others were given strength or speed or a body that could not be wounded. He was given the ability to be somebody else for as long as required. Was any of it real? Did a man ever actually do this? Not the man in the poem. But the operation, yes. That is the ordinary business of every war that has ever been fought. And the details in this story are correct in a way that suggests somebody who had heard veterans talk. A lost epic gave the episode more room than we have, apparently, and it is one of the poems we would most like to have back. What survives of it is a summary written centuries later, a few lines long, in which this whole night gets a single sentence. The archaeology gives us the setting rather than the event. The mound is real. The walls with their outward slope are real. The gate with its tower is real. And in the layer that best matches the story, excavators have found something that fits this script uncomfortably well. Houses subdivided into small rooms, storage jars sunk into floors in numbers far beyond what a family needs, people packed in. A crowded town full of people who had come in from the countryside with nothing, which is exactly the condition in which a stranger with a bad story and a beaten back can walk about all day without anybody looking twice. So let us go back out through that gate, and then we can rest. It is late afternoon. He goes out with the last of the traffic before they close it. A farm cart, some women carrying water jars, a boy driving 3 sheep. Nobody stops him on the way out. Nobody ever does. Getting into a besieged city is difficult. Getting out of one is a matter of walking, because nothing inside a wall is guarded against leaving. Down the ramp, across the flat ground, past the ford where the reeds are and the smell of the low green water, into the ditch and the scrub, and then a long, careful hour in the failing light, going wide, coming at the camp from the flank so as not to be shot by his own sentries, and then a challenge in the dark, and a name given, and a very long pause while somebody fetches a torch to look at his face. Feel the moment when the disguise comes off. The camp is a wall of noise after a day in a foreign city. His own language everywhere at volume. Somebody puts a cloak round him. There is a bath, the second in a day, and the water in this one is heated in a bronze cauldron over a fire he has known for 10 years. The dirt comes out of his neck and hands in dark streaks. The wheels have started to close, and they sting when the warm water reaches them. And then they stop. Oil again, and clean wool, and a chair, and food that is not given to him out of pity, and men leaning in to hear what he saw. He gives the report. Streets, gates, the guard on the lower approach, the unwatched way up on the northeast, where the allies are billeted, where the shrine is. He does not tell them about being recognized. There is no version in which he tells them that. And late that night, when the report is done and everybody is gone, he sits by himself outside the hut, where a friend of his beat his back with a strap 2 mornings ago, and looks at the walls across the plain, lit here and there with people asleep behind them. Somewhere in there, a girl went back inside with an empty cup. Let it be quiet now. The sea is doing what it has done under every part of this story, coming up the sand, going back, turning over the small stones at the top of the beach. The fires are down to red. The tide has come in over the grooves where the ships are drawn up, and it will be out again by morning. Above the camp, above the plain, above the walls, the sky has gone completely clear, and there is that thick, low band of stars you only get where there is no light for 100 miles in any direction. The wind has dropped. Somebody a few huts along is snoring. A dog is dreaming and running in its sleep. There is nothing to work out tonight, nothing to remember, no story to keep straight, nobody to be. You do not have to be anyone at all for the next few hours. That is what sleep is for, and it is the one disguise that costs nothing. Let your shoulders come down. Let the breath go all the way out, slowly, and let the next one arrive on its own. Sleep well.